Good morning. Today we are looking at an MP5. This is a real MP5 and we're comparing it side by side against the VFC. Now this is not a H&K MP5, this is actually made by Enfield, so this is a licensed production by Enfield for UK Special Forces that has then had the barrel drilled out for civilian ownership. This is of course entirely legal. So this MP5 has been in service with UK Special Forces and it did not see any kind of modernisation. I suspect I know why. The Selector actually doesn't work properly, or rather the Selector probably does, but inside the trigger box it is not holding the trigger back properly. We'll talk about that later. And so it didn't see any modernisation and therefore it got decommissioned. This one in particular is currently having its serial numbers verified by the Royal Armouries, and the owner is wanting to know whether it was used in the Iranian embassy siege. I'm personally very doubtful. That is there are quite a lot of MP5s in UKSF service, and I doubt that one in particular happened to be there at that particular point in time. But anyway, still very cool to see a real MP5 and be able to compare it directly against the VFC. Let's start with the receiver finish and general external appearance. Obviously these do look very different, but that is because there is a huge age difference between these two. It's hard to say at this point with this particular gun whether this would have closely matched the VFC. However, the VFC is using stamped steel and it is painted in the same kind of way. It's hard to say from this particular gun because they do look different. However, with that big age difference, it is what it is. We've got what we've got. In terms of feel of the steel to the touch and everything though, I mean, stamped steel is stamped steel, they feel the same. Handguards. On the VFC here we have a Surefire 628 reproduction. This is made by VFC, but obviously it's not suitable for direct comparison against the Enfield we have here. On the Enfield we have a tropical style thin handguard. Now we do also have a VFC tropical style thin handguard here on the desk, and we can see that there are some differences between the two. Namely, well, apart from the obvious pop marking of age and such, we have a much shinier appearance on the real one, and it feels different as well because of that shininess. It's not quite a tacky waxiness, but it is like, it looks how it feels, right? It's a different kind of finish to it. And this is unfortunately a point against VFC in this one because this is made by VFC, this particular handguard, and they haven't replicated the surface finish of that one. Charging handle. To charge an airsoft gun is always going to be less stiff than a real one. However, here on the VFC MP5 and the real MP5, there is a much bigger discrepancy than I was expecting. The VFC it's fine if you don't look at it in comparison to a real one. However, if you look at it in comparison to the real one and then do the real one, wow, that recoil spring on a real MP5 is so much stiffer than I was expecting, and that was a real eye-opener. The Enfield MP5 and the MP5 design in general is not a direct blowback, it is roller delayed, meaning that the pressure is lowered slightly by the time it is actually cycling the bolt. However, that thick recoil spring means that it is hitting the rear of the receiver with a much lower force, and this contributes to the MP5 being known for its very low recoil characteristics. The VFC, by comparison, very weak recoil spring in comparison to the real one. The strength difference between the two is such that you don't need to use the VFC in the same way as the real one. With the real one, you actually need to get at least a finger around the charging handle in order to bring that bolt to the rear. With the VFC, however, you really don't. It's just the recoil spring is not that strong. You don't need to be cognizant about it at all. Sight drum. The stiffness for incrementing the sight drum for the VFC and the Enfield MP5 are exactly the same, so excellent job there from VFC. That being said, of course, for the vast majority of purposes, we're going to be leaving the sight on the most open aperture setting. Speaking of sights, a general external point here between the VFC and real steel compatibility. The VFC is compatible with real claw-mounted optics such as this Hensoldt Ferro ZF Mod 1, and VFC also supplies their own version of the Picatinny arms mount. Onto magazines now. The real magazine is stamped sheet steel and the VFC magazine is a propane gas reservoir, so we are of course going to have a very big weight difference between the two. However, it's not so much that a fully loaded real magazine wouldn't be outside of the realms of similarity for the gas one. I was curious about whether the real mag would fit inside the VFC, just a point of curiosity. It wouldn't work at all. It did not, but it did fit inside, it just doesn't get quite up to the magazine catch. Speaking of the magazine catch, the paddle release for both the Enfield and the VFC MP5 felt exactly the same on both, and the stiffness of the magazines, their respective magazines coming in and out of the magwell, again exactly the same. So the action of reloading, well, the action of removing and adding magazine to both of these guns felt exactly the same, so fantastic point in VFC's favour there. The stock, both of these have retractable stocks, and they do actually stick on both. I have a G3 H&K retractable stock here, and that does also stick on occasion. Sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't, and this is also going to, the behaviour of this is also going to change when it's on the gun. However, converting it to get at that stock onto a VFC G3 gun is a little bit of an effort, so that's a whole future project. On the MP5 side, however, there was a noticeable lack of wobble on the real one compared to the VFC. There was still a little bit of wobble, but not to the same degree as the VFC, and the real stock did feel a lot more solid. It's worth noting, however, that the VFC is compatible, so we could put the real stock of an MP5 onto the VFC MP5 if we wished. The real stock, of course, does also feel a lot more sturdy, as mentioned, and it sounds a lot smoother as well. The VFC metal, however, speaking from experience, it is not sturdy enough to smooth out in the way that the Enfield has. I have had my MP5 for, well, I've had it for a while, but I haven't really put it through that much abuse, in my opinion, and the retaining latch for the MP5 sliding stock on the VFC does not work anymore. It cannot sit in its retracted position anymore. So the VFC metal is not really strong enough to hold up to general abuse, whereas the real one, of course, is. Trigger difference. We have a small amount of take up and then a pretty sharp break with a little bit of over travel. It's a bit heavy compared to the L85, but it's manageable and totally fine. The VFC it just doesn't. It is completely different. It's worse. It does not succeed in feeling like an MP5 trigger. However, there is a slight difference between the two in their external housings. We can see that that is a SCF housing on the Enfield, and it is a burst pack on the VFC. However, here we have an SCF VFC, and the feeling is exactly the same. We are not experiencing any differences between the VFC packs in that regard, and yeah, they do not compare to the real one, unfortunately. Speaking of packs and their selectors, the selector on the real one is so stiff, so stiff. Again, comparing the burst pack to the SCF is not a fair comparison. They are different, and it's the same for the VFC packs as well. The VFC SCF pack is a lot nicer in its clickiness to the burst pack, and the Navy pack especially. The Navy pack of the VFC is quite soft, really. But comparing the VFC SCF pack here on the desk to the Enfield SCF pack there on the real one, the Enfield is much stiffer. You wouldn't really consider changing that at a time when you really needed it. You would change it far before then and then rock it like that. That being said though, the VFC does feel totally fine both in the burst and the SCF pack. I don't really think this is a major point in VFC's detriment. I think this is more of a point in Enfield's detriment that is so stiff. Speaking of the safety in Selector, it comes to mind that I think this is the reason the weapon was allowed to be decommissioned and deactivated and then owned by civilian hands. The MP5 design is actually quite similar to the Steyr AUG, where the trigger pulling all the way to the rear will fire it in fully automatic, but the trigger pulling halfway will only fire it in semi-automatic. The MP5 is actually the same, however, the Selector will only allow the trigger to go a certain distance depending on its position. So, if the Selector on the MP5 is on the semi-automatic position, then it will only physically allow the trigger to go halfway. However, if the Selector on the MP5 is in the fully automatic position, then it can go all the way and it will fire fully automatic. However, if you have the Selector in the fully automatic position, only pull the trigger halfway, then because of the physics of the trigger box and the design of the mechanics, it will only fire in semi-automatic. This is something you can do on a real MP5, this is something you can do on the VFC. However, on this particular MP5, it doesn't matter. The semi-selector position does not hold the trigger and does not stop the trigger at that halfway position. Therefore, it fires in fully automatic even in the semi-automatic position. Taking apart a H&K trigger box is annoying. The VFC one here on the desk is actually very similar in design and very similar in amount of faff. So I dare say that is probably the reason that this particular weapon was allowed to be decommissioned and deactivated, because that is a bit of a large flaw, and I dare say that it wasn't worth working on when they had so many other MP5s in service. And that's it. VFC has done a very good job on the appearance, aside from that tropical style handguard, but things like the muzzle, the front sight, the rear sight, it does a very good job, and it has a lot of compatibility with their real counterpart as well. And VFC has done a very good job, but there are some points where it falls short. They're not really major points though. The main thing really is always going to be with airsoft guns, the recoil spring strength, and the fact that you don't really need to use that handle in the same way as a real one in order to get a reload done. It's not really a big deal though. I think VFC has done a fantastic job with their MP5, and that's all we've got for today. Thank you so much for watching. I apologise for the way the footage is and the fact that I didn't have audio for it, so you might actually see me talking in the corner there without anything coming out. It's just because the audio died when I was filming. It was done on very short notice. Once again, everything is legal and deactivated as it should be. And yeah, thanks for watching guys, much appreciated. Next video is potentially Viper Tech related. We shall see. Happy days. Cheers guys, see you around.